Welcome everyone to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening presentation series, science seminar series, put on by University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus in Nome and University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Sea Grant, also in Nome. And tonight, Straight Science is on the road, and I'm actually calling in from Anchorage. Both UAF Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, Central Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. And so, let's see, tonight we have Dan Ruthrauff.
Perfect.
And he's here in Anchorage with the United States Geological Survey at the Alaska Science Center here. And Dan, I was looking, he gave a little bio, and he's really been focusing on shorebirds, and he does some snow geese stuff too, but he focuses on documenting status, distribution, migration ecology, and reproductive ecology of shorebirds. So I think we've got a great speaker. And not only that, but he's doing his research on the Teller Highway. I almost named this, research on the Teller Highway, but that is close to Nome, and that's one of our 3 roads. So very excited for that. And tonight he's going to be talking about the incredible flight, the breeding ecology, and how young godwits prepare for a journey that I can only, I'll learn a lot on this talk. With that, know that I see a lot of videos, and up here we may not have the capacity. I'm in Anchorage, but I'm still using my Nome paranoia on the internet failure. And so you might want to, except for the speaker, we should all kind of turn our videos off if we could during the presentation, so he can get through that without any glitches. We do have a caller, and the caller, again, will have priority. It's very difficult to be a caller on a Zoom call because you can't raise your hand or unmask your face or do any of that stuff. So the caller will have priority if they want to jump on and ask a question. And so that will be that. Doug Watkins, you are on with your video. You might want to turn that off, or I can get to it if you can't hear me right now. With that, glad to see a talk on birds, and it feels like summer is upon us if you're in Anchorage tonight. And take it away, Dan. Thank you so much for coming.
Great. Thank you so much, Gay. Yeah, and it's great to see so many folks from literally all over the world. It's one thing I've learned on this project is that godwits, people love godwits, and people show up to hear about them. So I'm really thankful for that. So thank you for coming out today. And first, I'd like to start by thanking my co-authors. Jesse Conklin was my comrade in the field as we traipsed about trying to unlock the mysteries of the bar-tailed godwits, and it was very, very challenging, and I appreciate Jesse's ability to withstand tussocks and mosquitoes and wander around what seemed like fruitlessly at times, but ultimately with good success. And Jim Johnson provided good moral and spiritual and logistical support across this difficult field endeavor. And Bart Kempenars really helped support us by providing the very fancy transmitters that we put on these birds to track their migration. So thank you to all my co-authors. And I'll get this first slide out of the way. Hopefully it's the most boring slide we look at tonight, but I hope it helps explain to you why a wildlife biologist is talking to you tonight from the US Geological Survey. I'm not a geologist, but the USGS is, it's the science agency of the Department of Interior, and we have 5 mission areas, and you can see them listed there. And one of them is the ecosystem mission area. And this is a relatively new thing for the Geological Survey that we joined as a group of wildlife biologists in about 1996. And so that's why I'm here today. And researchers at the Alaska Science Center conduct research in all 5 of these mission areas. And we have no regulatory authority at the US Geological Survey. We're here really just to provide impartial and timely science information. We're primarily here to serve Department of Interior agencies, but also the public and other stakeholders. And that's why I'm happy to talk to you tonight. It's great to share our research with the public. So that's who I am, and that's what the agency does. And with that, I'll jump right into why you're all here tonight, and that's to learn about bird migration, and in particular, the amazing migration of bar-tailed godwits. Bar-tailed godwits conduct the longest nonstop migration in the animal kingdom, and we had the good luck to track this bird, B6, so named because of the unique alphanumeric character on the leg flag. We tracked this bird from its breeding site just outside of Nome all the way to Tasmania. Pretty amazing nonstop migration. And it all started in mid-October, which was kind of late. We were worried that this bird maybe wouldn't even migrate. But on October 13th, 2022, this bird took off from a site on the Kuskokwim Delta on the Nasconat Peninsula. And 11 days later, made landfall at a site called Anson's Bay in northeast Tasmania. And I should stress, it's hard to appreciate this, but bar-tailed godwits are not like waterfowl, like ducks and geese. They're not like seabirds, like albatross. These birds are not adapted to land on water. This is a nonstop flapping flight. These godwits are not like raptors. They don't soar on thermals. They're not like albatross, and they don't dynamically soar along waves. This is nonstop flapping flight for 11 days nonstop. So it's really hard to fit this migration on a map. It covers about 100 degrees of latitude, but that's the day-by-day location of this bird across its 11-day voyage. And this track was over 8,300 miles at an average speed of just over 30 miles an hour, but with high speeds of over 75 miles an hour. And it did all this while it was just 4 months old and had obviously never migrated before. It was hatched just 4 months previously. It didn't do any training. It wasn't lifting weights or jogging on the treadmill. It just took off one day and flew nonstop for 11 days. So really staggering migratory feat. So that's the story, but I'll give you a lot of background on why this is, I mean, it's obviously amazing, but give you background that hopefully makes you appreciate that it's even more fantastic than you might just see at face value. So I'll describe a little bit to you about what is a shorebird. Bar-tailed godwits are a type of shorebird, and shorebirds are renowned for their migratory feats. So I'll describe a little bit about shorebirds and then dive into what's a bar-tailed godwit and why do we study bar-tailed godwits? What's so intriguing about them and what makes studying them so important? And then finally, I'll get back into the details of that juvenile godwit B6's migration. So this might be kind of silly background for a lot of you, but when I use the term shorebird, it means something very specific. And in this slide here, you can see a montage of different images of birds of the shore. You see herons and egrets and puffins and murres. And to be sure, these are all birds of the shore. But when I use the term shorebird, I'm talking about a specific group of birds with shared natural history traits and a shared genetic descent. And this includes birds like sandpipers, curlews and godwits, like the topic of tonight's talk, plovers. I know plovers are really common birds on the tundra around the Bering Strait region, phalaropes, oyster catchers, and turnstones. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about shorebirds tonight. And almost by definition, shorebirds in Alaska have a high latitude distribution. Alaska is a pretty high latitude place, but these birds conduct long migrations to come to Alaska. That almost all the shorebirds in Alaska are migratory. There are very few that spend the winter here. And most of them come here to take advantage of this incredible pulse of resources in the spring and summer. And one thing that you've probably noticed in the images that I've shown so far is that these birds have long, thin bills, and this speaks to their foraging ecology, that shorebirds are, as the name implies, they're creatures of wetlands, and they forage in non-frozen water. And as we know, Alaska gets very, very cold in the winter. And so when it gets cold and these resources become less abundant and water starts to freeze, these birds migrate, which leads us to the topic of tonight's presentation. And I like to show this image. This is an image that depicts the migratory tracks of multiple shorebird species in the Pacific Basin. You can see the species-specific color codes in the upper right-hand corner. Really, it's just kind of a reminder to me that there's this amazing spectacle going on around us all the time. You know, twice a year, these birds moving across hemispheres. And it's easy sitting in my house in Anchorage to just forget that this is happening, this spectacular natural phenomenon. And it's really something that we've become able to better appreciate only very recently with the advent of really miniaturized tracking technologies. And these are little radio transmitters that we put on these birds' backs that give us information about where they go. And you can see there's, the white tracks along the coast of North and South America of whimbrels moving all up and down the Pacific Rim, the bristle-like curlews moving right across the Pacific Basin, red knots and great knots up and down the East Asia, Australasia flyway. And these are just a handful of birds that we've tagged. And it helps me appreciate the millions and millions of birds that are filling this aeroscape every spring and every fall, going about their business while I go about my business pretty much oblivious to what they're doing. So I'm really thankful for the opportunity to track these birds and get a better appreciation of their migrations. So why study shorebirds? I think what I've shown you so far helps you appreciate that they're charismatic and they're graceful and they're beautiful and they have a lot of really amazing physiological traits that make them very interesting study subjects. But more importantly, now, I think it's really imperative to study shorebirds because they're in steep population declines. This is a title of a recent paper. It's called Decline of the North American Avifauna, and it's sort of colloquially referred to as the 3 billion bird manuscript, that these authors documented a decline of the North American avifauna since 1970 of over 3 billion birds, from 10 billion birds in 1970 to about 7 billion birds now. So a huge loss to our natural heritage. And shorebirds comprise a huge chunk of this loss. That it's estimated that about 17 million shorebirds have been lost from North America, representing almost a 40% decline in shorebirds overall, and that these declines occur across almost all the species. That these researchers found that about 70% of shorebird species are thought to be in decline now. So there are a lot of great reasons to study shorebirds, but right now it's really imperative to study them to help reverse these population trends. So why study godwits in particular? Well, like I say, shorebirds are amazing, and godwits are really these exemplars of everything that's fascinating about shorebirds. Their migration ecologies, their fantastic breeding displays. They're really just amazing, charismatic critters, but they also have a lot of importance in many societies around the world. At both ends of the flyway here in Alaska, godwits are very important in the Yupik culture. This is a beautiful mask that is depicting a godwit from the lower Kuskokwim region from the early 1900s. The word, the Yupik word for godwit is tavat, and they're also an important subsistence resource for villages in the lower Kuskokwim region, where it's about 1,100 godwits a year are believed to be harvested, and they serve really important food resource. And at the other end of the flyway, and in I'm going to murder the pronunciation, Aotearoa, or New Zealand, godwits represent really important cultural images in Maori society and also in Australia and Aboriginal societies. So they hold really important cultural and subsistence importance around the world. And more importantly, they're just amazing, beautiful creatures, and they're worth studying. And unfortunately, most people in North America never get to appreciate godwits because they occur in a very, very small sliver of Western Alaska. Folks in the Bering Strait region are very lucky that they can just drive out the road and see godwits. But I've embedded this short video provided by Garrett Venn at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, showing some of the beautiful tundra scenes and a pair of godwits. That's a male sitting on the nest, and here's a female godwit coming to relieve her on the nest. And I'll shut up and just let you appreciate godwits, and hope you see the beauty that is inherent in their simple everyday life. So I hope that video gives you a little flavor of what it's like to be on the tundra, observing godwits, and hopefully that you could hear the call of the male there at the end. That call is evocative of the name in Yupik, Tavatavak, and the name in Maori, Kwaka. They're both onomatopoetic. They're really loud, kind of audacious creatures of the tundra, and they're really amazing to study. And the more that we've learned about them, just the wonder and amazement increases. And I'm going to go through a series of slides here that describes why studying the migration ecology has really important conservation value. And on this image, I'm showing migratory tracks of two different subspecies of bar-tailed godwit. There's the bar-tailed godwit that breeds in Alaska and winters in sites in New Zealand and in Eastern Australia. And then there's another subspecies that breeds in Siberia and winters, spends the non-breeding season in Western Australia. Shout out to Broome there. This is the work occurred at Broome Bird Observatory. And colleagues from New Zealand, Australia, and Alaska, they track these birds. And you can see that both of these birds conduct spring migrations to sites in the Yellow Sea. They co-occur together in the Yellow Sea. I'll show this here in my laser pointer. Long nonstop flights, 6,200 miles for the Alaska breeders, 3,600 miles for the birds that go to Siberia. They both stage together in the Yellow Sea for about 4 or 5 weeks to replenish their fat stores, and then they carry on to the breeding grounds. Another flight for the Siberia breeders of about 2,500 miles and about 4,200 miles for the Alaska breeders. As they come south, this is where the amazing migration of the Alaska breeders was unveiled. These nonstop flights from sites in the Kuskokwim Delta to non-breeding sites in Australia and New Zealand, nonstop flights over 7,500 miles, like I just described, the bird that went to Tasmania, 8,300 miles, while the birds that breed in Siberia, again, stage it back in the Yellow Sea, and they stage there and conduct a nonstop flight back to non-breeding sites in Australia. And this is important to note because my collaborator, Jesse Conklin, who I did this tracking study with, he's done a lot of research on godwits in New Zealand and Australia, including the study looking at annual survival rates. So this is annual survival rate on this axis and year across the x-axis. And one thing that you can see, the birds that breed in Alaska that visit the Yellow Sea only once in the spring, their survival rate has dropped recently, but not nearly as precipitously as the birds that visit the Yellow Sea twice, both in the spring and the fall. And this is really important because these connections weren't really well understood, that there's been a lot of work marking these birds with unique color band combinations, and you have to recite them. And honestly, people never see these birds in the breeding ground. So these connections between these non-breeding distributions, these stopover sites in the Yellow Sea, and where these birds ultimately breed wasn't well described until the advent of these tracking devices. And this is really important because the Yellow Sea is really suffering kind of an ecological disaster, that over 65% of the tidal flats have been reclaimed within the past 5 decades. This is a picture of bar-tailed godwits trying to stage quietly in the spring while mudflats around them are being reclaimed. And this obviously has a humongous impact on all the birds through this region, not just bar-tailed godwits. And there's also a lot of intentional, illegal take of godwits and accidental take associated with fisheries in the Yellow Sea region. So this is an incredibly important stopover for both of these subspecies, but the subspecies that visits it twice a year is declining at a more rapid rate than the one that breeds in Alaska and visits once a year. And understanding the migration ecology of these two subspecies really helped identify these threats. So with those sorts of things in mind, we, Jesse, Jim, Bart, and I set out to try and fill in some knowledge gaps specific to the Alaska end of the equation. It's really difficult to study these birds on the breeding grounds. And so we had some questions, like there's very little known about the growth and survival of bar-tailed godwits, or much known about their juvenile survival. So once they leave the nest and fledge and conduct their first migrations, what is their survival? And it's really a fascinating question. What is their survival during their first migration? And so we hope to address that with this study and then understand better the settlement and movement patterns of these birds, finish their first migration and settle in non-breeding sites in New Zealand and Australia. So in 2022, our goals were seemingly kind of modest, but I mean, honestly, it's sort of like saying that our goal was to climb Mount Everest. We knew that this was going to be very, very difficult. That there's a reason this information was not known. That it's really difficult to find nests for these species, and tracking chicks is very difficult. And we had hoped to determine, in the course of tracking these chicks, determine the growth and survival of the chicks. And then finally, right before they're fledged, we wanted to put these fancy transmitters on them and track them on their first migration. And we thought we had some great new ideas that had never been tried on bar-tailed godwits that would help us succeed. Here's a picture. This probably looks familiar to a lot of folks who've been out the Teller Road. This is overlooking the Livingston drainage, and we're listening for birds. And what we're doing is we used radio telemetry early in the study. So the idea was that we would find chicks either right in the nest as they hatched, or when they were being tended by their parents. And you can see on this image, there's a teeny tiny little 1 gram battery powered radio. And we trim a teeny little patch of feathers off the back and glue this to their back. And this we thought would be a really easy way to track them, that we would use radio telemetry. And here's a picture of Jesse holding an antenna and a radio receiver, and we're listening for these birds. And this has been used on other species of godwits in other parts of the world. And we thought, hey, this has never been tried on bar-tailed godwits. Let's see if we can track the chicks and stay on top of them using radio telemetry. And the idea was that we would track them and recapture them every 5 days or so. The little battery powered radios fall off after just a few days. So every 5 days or so, we would recapture them and reglue the radio. And along the way, we would measure their growth rates and estimate their survival. And right before they were getting ready to fledge, right before they could fly, we thought we would put on these fancy transmitters. So what you see here is a 5 gram solar powered transmitter with a stretchy silicone tubing harness that you affix it on the birds. It's on their lower back, and it goes around their legs almost like a climbing harness. And it's stretchy so it can accommodate the growth of the birds, because they put on, they double their body mass with pure fat prior to their migrations. And so you have to put on so that it's not too tight when these birds gain a bunch of body mass. And the other challenge that we had was that these chicks were growing while we were capturing them. So we also knew that we needed to accommodate their growth to become an adult chick, and then anticipate that they would double that body mass again while they were staging for their migration. So this was the idea. And then we would magically release these birds, and they'd go about and they'd reveal their secrets to us. And it all seemed like a pretty good idea. That was the plan. And you can tell by the way I'm setting this up that it didn't really go according to plan. And I alluded to the fact that no one's tried this before, and that's not totally true. Efforts to find nests of bar-tailed godwits generally fail. There's a godwit sitting on a nest here. I've circled it there in red. That's actually a pretty obvious bird sitting out. It was kind of perking up because I was there to take his picture, but godwits occur in really low densities, and they're very difficult nests to find. They sit very, very tight on the nest. But we reasoned that even if we couldn't find nests, that godwits are incredibly good parents, that once their chicks hatch, they go from being very quiet and very cryptic and camouflage on the tundra to being very aggressive and outgoing, and they will dive bomb you, and you will know if you're near a bar-tailed godwit brood by virtue of their defensive behaviors. And we reasoned that we would be able to catch up with some of these chicks, even if we couldn't find their nests, that we would find the parents tending to them. And this is a picture of a female that's actually brooding 4 very young chicks. And this is sort of what we thought would happen. That even if we couldn't find a nest, we'd find some broods and we'd be able to capture the chicks, glue the radios on, and follow them. And we know that as godwit chicks age, they start to disperse, that once they're about 5 to 7 days old, they no longer need to be brooded by their parents, that they're able to maintain their body heat on their own, and they scatter. And there's typically 4 chicks in a bar-tailed godwit brood, and while they're very young, they're often very close together, making it easy to catch all at once. But as they age, they scatter all over the place, and you can see they become quite well camouflaged. That's a chick hunkering down on the tundra, hiding from me. And we actually found that they will actually bury themselves in the tussocks and become just completely impossible to find. So we thought, okay, we're going to have little radios on these birds. We just need to catch them once, and then we can keep recapturing them, and that'll get us over the hump. And it didn't quite go like that. We were at Nome in 2022 from 25th of June until the 20th of July. We found all of one nest, and that was pretty unusual that Jesse had worked out on the Teller Highway in previous years, and without really trying to find nests, he found 6 to 8 nests a year. So we just had really bad luck last year. We're not sure why, but we came to learn that a lot of the nests hatched before we were able to find them. The one nest we did find was a pretty late nest, and that was by virtue of bumping into broods later that we realized, oh gosh, these nests had already hatched, and we just kind of missed the boat on them. And so we were left trying to track broods, and in total, we encountered 6 different broods, and we are only able to recapture 10 chicks from those 6 broods. And like I mentioned, there's typically 4 chicks in a shorebird brood. So in theory, there were 24 chicks scampering around out there associated with these broods, but it was very, very difficult for us to find them. And even when we did find them and glue radios to them, it became really difficult to stay on top of them. That you can see in that picture that the landscape out there, the tundra is wide open. And much to our surprise, these birds, these teeny chicks, some just 2 weeks old, and even very fresh chicks, some 2 or 3 days old, the young chicks were moving 1 to 2 kilometers a day, and the older chicks were moving 3 to 5 kilometers a day. And unfortunately, the range on these little VHF radios is about 2 kilometers. And so if they weren't anywhere near the road, we weren't going to find them. And they quickly scattered to all corners of the Teller wetlands. And so we were spending long days just tromping around, hoping that we'd pick them up with our radio telemetry. So contrary to what we thought, we thought we'd just happily track these chicks and every few days recapture them and measure them and get their survival rates and their growth rates and re-glue the transmitter on and just keep following them. It was really a mad scramble to stay on top of them. And some chicks we only tracked for 1 day before they just completely disappeared. And others we tracked for 5 days. And that was where we got really lucky. We had one brood that we encountered on the 11th of July. And we estimated that they were about 22 days old based on their body mass. And we actually encountered 3 chicks from this brood. It was just dumb luck. We came over a rise and there were 3 chicks and 2 parents, and the parents went ballistic and the chicks started running. And it was like the only real solid luck that we had almost in our 4 weeks out there. And as we started to kind of see the writing on the wall that it's really hard to track these chicks, we re-encountered this brood of 3 chicks 4 days later on the 15th of July. They're about 26 days old at that point, we reasoned. And we realized that it was going to be super hard to ever find these chicks again, even with the little VHF radios on their backs. So at that point, we deployed these 3 fancy radios. I'm calling them PTTs here. That's the type of radio, that solar powered radio that talks to satellites, and we don't need to tromp around the tundra trying to find them, that we sit back and we download the locations from the comfort of our office, looking at our computer screens. This was a little earlier than we wanted to deploy these radios. We would have liked to put them out on slightly bigger chicks, but we decided to go for broke. And sure enough, that was the last time we encountered any of these chicks out there. So we put out 3 fancy radios on these 3 fancy, now bejeweled chicks, and we let them go, and we hope for the best. And based on previous information, what we thought was going to happen is that B6 and this bird's siblings, these 2 other chicks in this brood, would find their way to the coast, that there are a lot of records of bar-tailed godwits from the Safety Sound region or the mouth of the Nome River. And we thought that these birds might go stage there, and that they would then carry on to the region around the mouth of the Kuskokwim. There's a series of big shoals that hold a lot of godwits prior to their fall migration, that almost the entire population stages there in mid-August. And from there, we thought that based on previous work and from talking to colleagues in New Zealand and Australia, we know that the adults precede the juveniles. And so we thought that the adults would be departing, and based on aerial surveys that we've conducted in the past, that would probably start happening in late August or early September, and that the juvenile birds would then follow on their own sometime in late September. This is a picture of a fully fledged, very handsome looking juvenile bar-tailed godwit, and that's getting ready for migration. And so a lot of those suppositions were based on work that others like my predecessor, Bob Gill, and a colleague on the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge, Brian McCaffrey, they had done surveys at sites in Western Alaska, and colleagues and I replicated those surveys, and you can basically see the track of our survey lines go from the mouth of the Yukon all the way down and around the mouth of the Kuskokwim down to Jack Smith Bay, and then we also flew from the mouth of the Kwijak River all the way down to Nelson Lagoon, and these are basically all the sites in Western Alaska that might reasonably hold godwits as they're staging for their migrations to New Zealand and Australia. And you can see that basically there's this huge hotspot right at Kuskokwim Shoals near the village of Kipnuk, that basically we saw 90,000 godwits in this teeny little area, and that represents about 90% of the Alaska breeding godwits. That essentially all the godwits go and stage here prior to migration. And what this looks like, this is a purposefully kind of miserable image showing you a humongous flock of godwits. This is a flock of 30,000 godwits that we encountered out on these sand flats off of the tip of Cape Avanoff near Kipnuk. And it's impossible to see. This is a photo stitch image that we took from a plane, but when I blow it up, you can see all these teeny little colored dots, and that's how we digitized them and counted this flock. So this was a flock of 29,000 birds. That was like a quarter of the world population of the Alaska breeding bar-tailed godwits, just happily staging out on these sand flats. And that's the sort of thing that I personally cannot, there's no use in trying to estimate a flock size that big. That's why we took pictures and counted them. This is another flock. This is any wild guess. It's really, really hard to estimate. And so, like I say, I've just taken to counting. You can see that this is a photo stitched image. You can see a stitch line here, but as you zoom in, you start to see, and that was a flock of 6,700 godwits. So these sites are critically important to these godwits, just like the Yellow Sea and spring migration. These Alaska breeding godwits are all staging on the lower Kuskokwim in these huge flocks prior to migrating to Australia and New Zealand. So this is what we thought was going to happen. And here's where the kicker comes in. What actually happened? Well, for about the first 2 weeks after we deployed those 3 solar powered transmitters on the 3 chicks in the Livingston Creek drainage, they all kind of did what we thought, that the accuracy of these transmitters isn't that great. So for instance, these movements are probably not real movements. These birds are still not flighted. They can't fly yet. They were still juveniles, and we think they were still just walking around on these ridges, but that these airs make it look like they're still there's still life, that these birds are still active. And so we were crossing our fingers, and sure enough, on the 3rd of August, from the 3rd to the 6th of August, one of these 3 chicks, B6, jumped over from the Livingston Creek drainage into the Chinook River drainage. And you can see we're still getting some locations from these other 2 chicks over here. And as time went on, we realized that either these chicks were dead and they had these transmitters attached to their back. They could have been eaten by a fox or taken by a falcon, or what we hope happened is that we simply put these transmitters on too loosely, that we had to put them on very loosely to accommodate their growth. And we hope that these birds just walked out of their transmitters. Honestly, we have no idea. All we know is that these 2 transmitters never moved again, while this bird, B6, moved over to an adjacent drainage. And contrary to our belief that they might stage at the mouth of the Nome River or go out to Safety Sound, this bird, without any previous experience flying, just casually flew across Norton Sound and made landfall near St. Michael and Stebbins area, and immediately continued kind of up the Yukon drainage to sites around Scammon and Kokachik Bay in Western Alaska, and made its way down to Hazen Bay sometime between mid-August and the first week of September. And it eventually settled at a site on the Nasconnet Peninsula, which is just north of Kigagak Island. This is Nilsen Island. here's New Talk, and the new village of Mertarvik is over here for helping folks orient. And the bird stayed at this site from the 8th of September through the 11th of October. And honestly, we started to think that maybe this bird wasn't going to migrate, that the 11th of October was pretty late, that typically all the godwits have arrived in Australia and New Zealand by then. And so we were wondering if this bird was just simply too late to migrate, that something had gone wrong, or maybe the transmitter had fallen off. We weren't sure, but it wasn't making big movements until on the 13th of October, Gay was talking about the crazy storms that blow through the Bering Sea region. As you folks know, you get these amazing low pressure systems that track across the Aleutians, and bar-tailed godwits are really adept at taking advantage of these for wind assistance. And the bird hopped on the back of this low pressure system and got an amazing tailwind and launched on the 13th of October. And I still remember the email from Jesse when he was tracking these birds. We basically thought this wasn't going to happen. And then suddenly there was an email that dropped in where it was just a big long yee-haw across the email, because finally the bird was launching. And yeah, it seemed so late, but there it went. And you can see this is sort of a heat map that shows the speed along the way. It had huge tailwinds and was really trucking at first right out over the Gulf of Alaska. This plot on the right-hand side shows the speed as a function of day. And again, this massive tailwind at the start of the voyage. But then across the heart of the voyage, bird B6 wasn't moving really fast. It was going as low as 20 kilometers an hour at some point. So really kind of at a slow jogging pace, but persistence pays off. And towards the end, got more tailwind assistance as it came in 11 days later on October 24th and made landfall at Anson's Bay. This was the wind regime as it was coming down. And we were kind of terrified. The bird was coming just straight down between New Zealand and Australia. And those, most of the godwits that breed in Alaska go to New Zealand. A fair number go to Australia, Eastern Australia, but it was going way too far south. And it was like, buddy, you're going to Antarctica. You better do something. And this quartering wind here pushed it right into Tasmania, which was great. We were happy to see that. And from the time it made landfall in Anson's Bay, 24th of October until about 5th of November, we received locations from the bird. And it looked like agricultural fields, and it was roosting out at a shoreline area. And we got a hold of folks in Tasmania to see if they could go out and try and recite this bird. And it turned out that this is a very, very remote area, and there were horrible storms going on at the time, and the roads were washed out. And so we couldn't actually get anyone out there during the time when the radio was still working. And sometime around the 5th of November, we stopped receiving transmissions from the bird. And again, we don't know if that means that over the course of its 11-day flight, it lost so much weight that it simply walked out of its transmitter when it landed. That's not uncommon. Jesse's had this happen with other birds that he's tracked from New Zealand. Or again, perhaps the bird died and the transmitter is lying there somewhere face down, not getting sun anymore. So sort of just to re-encapsulate that 11-day voyage, 8,300 miles, 32 miles per hour with peak speeds of over 76 miles per hour, all again at an age of 4 months, having never flown really any distance in its life before, didn't know where it was going, but obviously had some sort of map and some GPS to get itself there. Really amazing. And this sort of, much to our surprise, we've studied godwits for a long time and we think they're amazing, but this really caught fire with the media, and it got touted as the world record longest migration. And I think that's kind of funny that we, as humans, want to put some label on it that it's the world record, because obviously B6 doesn't care what it's doing. It's just going about its business being a godwit. But it really inspired a lot of people, and putting terms on it like world record, if that helps elevate the profile of the bird, that's great. It got a lot of press, and it's been really wonderful to share the story with people. You can't help but to be impressed, and we just hope it helps the species in some way. So the biggest question we're always asked is, where is B6 now? And man, we wish we knew. The radio is no longer functioning, like I said, and it's been 2 years now. We're really hoping that we see this bird again, or somebody sees this bird by virtue of the alphanumeric leg flag, so that we can identify it and just know that it's still around. Bar-tailed godwits, when they're subadults, the belief used to be that they didn't breed and they didn't migrate until they were 4 years old. Jesse's been doing recent tracking in New Zealand where he captures juveniles that have just arrived from Alaska, and he's tagged them, assuming that they were just going to kind of sit around in New Zealand. That was the common paradigm. But he's in fact found that some of them go on migrations in their first year. Some go on little walkabouts all the way to Alaska, but don't breed. So they're highly mobile as juveniles, and we're hoping that B6 turns up somewhere in the Yellow Sea where people might see it and get a recite. So what's next? Well, this is a picture that Jesse sent me just yesterday from a site in New Zealand. Jesse's been working at this spot, Foxton, in New Zealand for 17 years. He did his PhD down there. And if you look in this image, you see birds with colored leg bands. And Jesse's got a marked population. He's been working down there with Phil Batley and David Melville for, like I say, 17 years, marking birds and watching them on their individual departures. And that these birds keep an amazing annual rhythm that they tend to take off, plus or minus 2 or 3 days of the previous year's departure dates, and they all have very different schedules. That the birds that breed further in the north of Alaska tend to depart later than those that breed further south. And so they all have individual departure decisions to make. And Jesse's had the good fortune to be down there for each of the last 17 boreal springs. It's fall and in New Zealand as these birds are leaving. And you can see just how fat these birds are. They're very svelte, they're very graceful, but they're pretty chunky that they've been fueling up. And this is an actual picture of a flock that Jesse documented flying to the Yellow Sea. He sees these departures and he takes pictures and he knows who left. So what's next? Well, the Godwits are going about their business and they're on their way back to Alaska. It's always nice to think, when I look out the window and see piles and piles of snow, that these birds know what's going on and they'll be here soon enough. So that's what's going on with the Godwits. What's next for us is we would love to try to replicate this study, learning what we learned on the Nome road system and maybe putting it to use on the Yukon Delta, where there are higher densities of Godwits, and the terrain is different enough that there's many sloughs and water bodies on the Yukon Delta that we hope would constrain the movement of the Godwits a little bit more. That at Nome, just our creaky old 55-year-old knees, we could not keep up with these birds. Even though they're 2-week-old little fuzzballs, they could outwalk us. And we're hoping that if we were to replicate this study on the Yukon Delta, we might have better luck of actually tracking these birds and getting more of them tagged and outfitted so we could understand their survival and their growth and ultimately their first migrations. So that's what I have for you today. I thank you all for the opportunity to talk today. The UAF Northwest Campus, Alaska Sea Grant, National Park Service in Nome supported our work with a very generous donation of vehicles and letting us stay at the bunkhouse. A ton of people donated beautiful photos. Nick Haydukovich, who is a crackerjack pilot in Nome, he helped us find the birds out on the Teller Road. So thank you, Nick. Garrett Vin, thank you for the lovely video. And Mihai, thank you for providing some of the images showing the migration route. And I'd be happy to take any questions for you now if you have any thoughts. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dan. And it's straight science. Before we get to questions, or while people are forming their questions, this is the time we show the speaker in the chat box a little love for his presentation. And it was a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much, Dan. And it is never easy to be a public speaker. Even if you've done it a million times, you still get the little like, whoa, and it was beautiful. Both your oral presentation and these amazing photographs and your amazing bird and the story of that. So thank you so much. And we will take questions, but we do have a caller. So caller, if you want to unmute, if you have any questions, you can unmute first and be the first one. Or if you don't have any questions, then hang tight. And if you think of a question as we're going, feel free to unmute and ask your questions. And if you step on somebody while you're unmuting and asking your questions, it's okay, because it is hard to be a phone caller on a Zoom call. With that, I see lots of kudos in the chat box. Thank you, Dan. I know I had a question. So it seems like you're not coming back next year. Is that what we're hearing? To Nome?
Yes, we're not going
Oh,
anywhere, unfortunately. As
oh,
much as people love this study, it's really hard to get it funded.
sure.
This sort of basic science is oftentimes difficult to pitch, and there's a lot of interest in this, and we'd like to pull it off, but we need to, yeah, get some financial support.
Okay, well, that's a knife through the heart right there. But okay, okay, you're going to the maybe you're going to the Costco. But you know, thinking about your thing about it was hard to see the birds and the birds were difficult last summer. For the people who weren't in Nome or not in the Bering Strait region, last summer we were beset with rain. I don't know if everyone noticed that most of your pictures had gray as you were as you were picking those birds up and whatnot and showing the tag and all that. Gray and cold. Did the weather and so much moisture we're getting now? It seems we have a new, we have one of the best weather and climate people right here on tonight. And, we're seeing that we're getting a lot more moisture. Is that affecting their nesting or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And recall this was 2022, but I think
Oh,
that was also
2022.
a gray, cool, wet summer.
We
Jesse and I certainly got rained on quite a bit. Uh, and yeah, I don't, Jim Johnson has worked on the Nome road system quite a bit and would have a better perspective on what's more typical out there. And Jesse had worked there in the past and had a much easier time finding nests. I honestly think that sometimes spring conditions can be such that the birds just decide not to breed. And it sure seemed like there were lower densities than what Jesse had seen in the past. Areas along like the Sinick River drainage, he's always encountered birds there. We never found broods there. Uh, we really got lucky with help from Nick Dukovic in finding these broods where we did in the Livingston Creek drainage. But yeah, it did seem like the numbers were down, but I don't have a great sort of foundation from which to say whether or not it was unusual or not. Everyone I talked to when we were out there in 2022 was saying this is weird. You should have found more nests and there should be more broods around. So whether it was a one-off or things have changed, I can't really say.
Things have changed. I don't know about for the birds, but certainly our conditions have been wonky, to say the
Yeah.
So you are starting to get questions in the chat. I don't see anyone with the hands raised. So the first one is actually a comment. Uh, let's see. We catch and mark black and yellow ELF, capital ELF waders at Kamchatka Peninsula, Russia since 2016. In 2023, we caught 79 bar-tailed godwits. That was Dimitri.
Oh, cool. ELF is engraved leg flag, so like B6, so uniquely banded birds. That's great, Dimitri.
And then Cortland Brown, is tracking chicks using drones an option?
That's a good question, Cortland. Honestly, I think they would outlast the battery of any drone. Maybe you could cycle them back. Uh, we did often wish that we had two more humans out there just to help us divide and conquer, because we would find the broods one day and go back to the same spot the next day, and invariably they'd be 3 kilometers further away, but often not in a place where you could access them from the road. So I'm not sure that a drone would have helped us in that sense. I know that like Jim Johnson has used drones further up the road, just at like mile 32 on his red knot study to find nesting birds. So there is a lot of really great application of drones using thermal imagery to find nests. And maybe that would really help you find chicks if you went out on a cool day where the chicks might stand out. We certainly could have used it. I know Jim Johnson, he also uses these handheld thermal imaging cameras we kick ourselves. It would have been nice to drag those around with us. I don't know, the chicks can be quite well insulated, and maybe the environmental difference between the chick and the ground wasn't such that it would have shown up. But honestly, we need to try something else, because doing it with the radios wasn't working. They could just go so far, and we needed more help. And oftentimes we were in a brood and we knew there were chicks around, but we just couldn't find them because it's literally needle in a haystack. So yeah, thermal imaging on a drone might be a good thing to try.
All right. And Sharon Butler, who is down in Homer, looks like what's the best time of year to see godwits in Alaska?
Gosh, Nome is really unique in that you can fly there with Alaska Air and rent a car and drive out the road and see them. I personally think going out there in the spring and seeing their breeding displays is the best time to see them, and that would probably be late May. You might show up and find the tundra covered with snow and godwits kind of looking around at each other, wondering what's going on, but you might show up and nail it perfectly and hit their breeding displays. The males have these amazing far-reaching displays where they chase other birds, and they have this undulating flight, and they have this beautiful song. It's really a fun time to be out there when they're all in their territorial displays. So yeah, late May, early June would be a good time.
Awesome. Then Phil Batley says, hey, Dan, where did B6 fuel up relative to Tutakoke? That's how you pronounce that, I'm not sure. In 2004, we, led by Bob, encountered big flocks of mostly juveniles in the sandbars offshore there. Seems that maybe the juveniles may use different sites to most adults.
Phil, I don't want to hear your questions. That was a Phil, I love
We
you.
can move on.
No, that was a great question. And Phil, I mean, this is Phil's photo that we're looking at here. Wonderful waiter researcher in New Zealand. And yeah, he visited, worked with my former supervisor, Bob Gill, in 2004 and 5. And they had great luck, and they found, yeah, big flocks of juvenile godwits at a site called Tutakoke. And we have since flown surveys there, Phil, and we really haven't encountered hardly any birds on our aerial surveys. We still sort of have dreams that we would just go out there and give it a whack, just go out in a lund and set up camp and see if we can entice some juveniles. The site where B6 staged is probably another 30 kilometers south, and kind of unusual, not in an area where we see a ton of birds during the aerial surveys. But the latest we've flown our aerial surveys, gosh, I think it's probably not much past the second week of September, and this bird took off on October 11th. So that's something I'd love to learn by going out to some of those villages like Kipnuk and Chafornak. How long are these birds out there, and where are they staging? Because it just gets too hard for us to fly out there later in the year. So we'd love to know, because yeah, I think obviously the juveniles stay longer than the adults. And if we could get out there and see where they are, maybe have a Hail Mary chance of catching them, tracking them that way.
I hope that answered your question, Phil.
Thanks, Dan.
Sounds good. And then Daniela Lacerdo. Hey, love this presentation. Thank you. I'm interested to know, what is the breeding success for these birds? Do all 4 eggs usually successfully hatch? Do chicks make it to fledglings? What are the main threats to these birds during breeding? That's a parcel of questions.
And it's a bunch of questions that we really can't answer, Danielle. That was one of our goals, was to monitor nests that, so one of my mentors, Brian McCaffrey, he was a wildlife biologist in the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge for many, many years. He and Jesse actually tried to study the breeding ecology of bar-tailed godwits at a site called Old Chivak, which is on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. And it has really high densities of godwits. And the year that he and Jesse were out nest searching, every single nest that Brian found failed. And he was incredibly careful in how he monitored the nest. He walked around the tundra with a step ladder, a huge step ladder, so that he could set up his ladder and look at the nest from 30 meters away, so he wasn't leaving a scent trail. Brian was really meticulous and careful about what he was doing, and still the nest failed. So we really don't know. That was something we'd love to try to replicate, but we're not kidding ourselves that it would be much different. One thing that folks like Phil Batley have taught us is that there appear to be these years where there are pulses of juveniles. Some years, the proportion of juveniles showing up in New Zealand is quite low. Every 5th year, maybe the proportion of juveniles is 15 to 20% in the flock. So it seems like they might have this kind of pulse of reproduction, and that might be tied to the cycles of voles and lemmings that might swamp predators and let the godwits have a release and have a successful breeding year. But honestly, that was one of our goals, was to see if we could find and monitor nests, but it's been a very, very difficult task. And we failed miserably at Nome, and other folks who've tried on the Yukon Delta have had a really tough time. So it's really difficult. It's a good question.
All right. Then Sarah Keller asks, what is the staging area's land conservation status in Alaska? And do you mean, Sarah, by the Teller Road, or do you mean in Alaska? That's a hard question. That's to cut down. And what governing body has influence over the staging areas in the Yellow Sea?
Yeah. So actually, the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge skirts the edge of these, and the shoals themselves, there are some very small, they show up as islands on the map, but they go underwater at high tides. Those are actually administered by the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. So those shoals, like where I showed you that image of 30,000 godwits, part of that is within the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. And anything that's below the, what is it, Gay, the mean high tide line would be state lands. So they don't have any special protection status, other than that some of those shoals are within a wildlife refuge. But honestly, that doesn't, that protects them in some ways, but yeah, they don't have anything elevated beyond their status as in a wildlife refuge.
And you're just talking about, there's so much land you're talking about when you're talking about your godwits, and you're talking about down at that little shoal area for the
right. Yeah.
There's for all the breeding land or the nesting areas they're on and things like that. I don't know. That's why I said I guess the staging area is what she's really asking, but
yeah,
and tricky.
And thankfully, the heart of the breeding range is the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge. So there is some conservation status there. We're pretty fortunate in Alaska that we don't suffer a lot of the problems that, sites in the rest of the world suffer, that we're really pretty pristine, but we are suffering, obviously, effects of climate change. And these birds sort of suffer these carryover effects from whatever is happening, say, in the Yellow Sea. So even though things in Alaska are relatively pristine, they're still vulnerable here to things that we can't even mitigate, like climate change. So and your question about the conservation status of lands in the Yellow Sea, a lot of the sites that are used by the godwits are Chinese, and but there's also sites that are in North Korea and in South Korea. And sort of luckily, North Korea hasn't suffered the same level of reclamation that sites in China and South Korea have, that the tidal flats in those regions have been really diminished in a huge way. Like I say, 65% loss over the last 50 years. North Korea, just due to their relatively, low impact economy, they haven't reclaimed quite as much of those tidal flats. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that the Chinese government has recognized that this sort of like rampant reclamation is unsupportable, both economically, which I think really changed the tides, and environmentally, that they recognize that this damage was insupportable. And the economic engine that created a lot of that reclamation slowed down with the downturn in the Chinese economy, and they implemented a lot of conservation measures. So Thankfully, sites in the Yellow Sea are getting broader protections, but it's still really a very tenuous ecological system where, I mean, the Yellow Sea, there's more threatened water birds there than in anywhere in the world. That it's such a critically important migratory stopover site for so many birds in Asia. And it was so negatively impacted that it's going to take a lot to recover and maintain it.
All right. Thank you for that. And Rick Toman, who is with UAF, the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, and he really is an expert in the field for all of us in Alaska. He wanted to just note that both 2022 and 2023 had comparatively warm and dry Junes, but then wet July and Augusts. If that helps, just so you can put that in your notes.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah.
And then Dmitry Dorofev. Sorry, Dmitry, if I got that wrong. Dan, do you know if there are any difference in bill length and wing length between juvenile birds and adult birds at the start of the migration?
That's a good question. I believe there are. I know we used to do a lot of sampling for avian influenza at sites near the Tatakok River that Phil Batley mentioned. And just by pure dumb luck, we would catch a few godwits every year, and it was always juvenile godwits. And by pure dumb luck, Phil caught one of those juvenile godwits. So we had measurements in Alaska prior to migration. Phil had measurements once it had arrived in New Zealand, and they were still growing. That, I mean, they have very obvious plumage differences, as I'm sure you're aware, but they're still not quite attaining the structural size. Their wings seemingly are adjusted about at adult size, but their bills are still growing quite a bit. We were shocked. That picture of B6 that's on my very first slide, for such a young bird, they put a lot of energy into their wing. They want to get flighted as soon as possible, and they had a really long wing cord, even though it was only 2.5 weeks old.
And then Kirsty Carr has, do you know how population trends for other subspecies of bardtails compare to the two subspecies highlighted there?
Oh gosh, I'll stick my neck out. I was just reading a paper today by Jesse talking about the genetic structure of all the subspecies. And so bardtail godwits breed all around the Arctic. They breed in Finno-Scandia, in the Taimyr Peninsula, and the Yamal River Basin in Siberia. And I believe the only subspecies that's believed to be increasing is the nominate subspecies, Lamosa laponica, that breeds in like Finland, Sweden, and Norway. There aren't, the conservation status of bard-tailed godwits around the world is considered near threatened, due largely to trends in the East Asia Australasia flyaway, where there are 3 subspecies. There's the birds that breed in Alaska, the birds that I showed you in that image, the Minsbrai subspecies that breeds in Siberia, and then there's another, the Anadorensis subspecies, that's sort of this cryptic subspecies that we don't know much about. But the Minsbrai population appears to be doing the worst. Counts from New Zealand and Australia suggest that the bard-tailed population has kind of stabilized, but there's still concern just based on the reliance on the Yellow Sea. So sorry, maybe not the most satisfying answer, but at least one of the populations is believed to be increasing, but others are stable or decreasing, and conservation status as a whole is near threatened.
All right. And the caller, a shout out to the caller. They've remained silent, but we just want to let them know that you can jump on at any time. My question is, we've got the golden plover in the Nome, Bering Strait, Seward Peninsula region. That's a long distance flyer too. Is there anything that, I don't know, connects those birds? And are they both kind of trending the same way in their population? Are they both kind of sticking together, or are they really different in their?
That's a good question. Population trajectory of Pacific golden plovers. I believe their populations are stable. Uh, yeah, the more we've learned about these migrations, the more we've begun to appreciate that it's not that unusual for these birds to make these epic trans-Pacific migrations, that wandering tattlers, ruddy turnstones, sharp-tailed sandpipers. There's a whole suite of shorebird species that we suspect are doing this. Some of them are still just a little too small for us to track without negatively affecting them too much. So the bar-tailed godwit is one that we know really well, but species like Pacific golden plover also occur in New Zealand and Australia and are probably conducting these same nonstop flights. My take, Gay, I believe that population status of golden plovers is pretty good. I'll look that up and get back to you if I'm totally wrong. And it raises an interesting question, like what is the survival risk of this migration? It seems outrageous to us and seems very risky. But you know, evolution works on predictability and stability. And really, this might be a deadly, predictable, very safe migration route that with these predictable weather systems that give them tailwinds, there are no predators out over the Pacific, that this might be actually, some people suggest that this is like this ecological corridor that they're taking advantage of and that it's not at all a risky thing. So yeah, population
Wow.
trajectory doesn't seem to link to these migrations in the ways that you might think.
Well, it was impressive to see that little bird you had, 4 months old, make its way down and sort of wait for a low. That's what it looked like. And, you know, to me, that sort of blew my mind that these birds are able to somehow think about it, know about it, or just luck out. And I think that's a really interesting one. And I'm just going to give a shout out. Rick, Toma, do you have any thoughts on that with our changing, our low patterns supposed to become more intense or less intense, or does it stay the same? Are you still on? He may have left. But he was,
That is
it's,
a real active area of research, like what's going to
Yeah.
happen under climate scenarios. My former supervisor and mentor Bob Gill has done a lot of work along, you know, with folks like Phil and Jesse, looking at wind assisted migration in these birds. And yeah, they are their own little meteorologists. They have some sort of crazy telekinesis where Bob has documented that their departure decisions are predicated on wind assistance, you know, sometimes thousands of kilometers offshore, that, like you say, Gay, they can sense these low pressure systems and we don't know how they do it. But they're not just winging it. They take off, they know when to go,
so to
and they
speak,
take advantage of these winds. Yeah, it's
so to speak.
so to
They are
speak,
winging
yeah.
it.
They are winging it.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's good.
Every
But,
flap counts, but it's not random. They make departure decisions that are completely sound with respect to their wind assistant migration. And I don't know, I thought maybe Dave Douglas was on the line. I thought I saw him. He might be able to speak to the future climate projections, but my recollection was that a lot of the climate models suggest that the Aleutian low will remain intact under warming climate scenarios, and that these birds will still be able to rely on it moving forward. But
is that's the good news.
yes, yeah, that this cyclogenesis that always happens with these low pressure systems across the Aleutian, that I think that that's predicted to not change dramatically in the near future.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. And, oh, look at that. So, oh, actually, Pete Rob, is it known if young birds return to breed in the general area where they came from? Oh, hi, Kate.
Good question. We have no idea about, yeah, that's termed philopatry, about returning to your natal origin. There have been so few young godwits marked, and we really have no idea that other monogamous territorial shorebirds tend to show that they tend to return to near where they were born. But again, it's sort of needle in a haystack sort of thing to even document that. And bar-tailed godwit would be a wonderful opportunity to assess that. If we could stick a radio on these birds, some of these radios last, I mean, they're solar powered, they can last for years and years and years, and it would be really fascinating to track these birds back to their breeding grounds and see where they settle.
All right, and then Jim D got news in the chat to share that we are having a permission, it looks like, has been given to a gold mining company to dredge in the Bonanza Channel in the Safety Sound area. So you'll probably get contacted, Dan, by people who have concerns.
I'd heard about that with respect to the eelgrass beds. So yeah, interesting.
With that, and so what was the good news? You said you had some good news. Was that
Godwits are good news.
okay? Godwits are good. I can see that. Godwits are good news. What is good news for me tonight was you kind of made me, we haven't had this range of and diversity of countries and individuals on like this. And it
Yeah, it's
actually
fantastic.
thinking about our ecosystem, wherever we are, we're all kind of connected. And that's what I take home as the good news for tonight. These birds, it's fairly amazing that, you know, we're saying hi to people in Australia. They're seeing the same birds that are on the Teller Highway for us. And so it's very interesting feeling for me, like we're all in a big company. And Magadan, shout out, and there's Indonesia and Australia. We really are all united, and I take that as a good, that makes me feel better tonight. Everybody had something to say or whatnot. So next week, we've got a double header for Strait Science. So hang on. The Strait Science we have on March 26th, which will be Tuesday, will be the ice seal, the NOAA Polar Ecosystems Program. That's going to be talking about their ice seal survey that will be going on in the Bering Strait region, staged out of Nome for 2 or 3 weeks. We'll learn more about that. And on Thursday, March 28th, we're going to have Andy Ramey with the US Geological Survey, same group as Dan's, and he'll be giving us an update on avian influenza. And it just won't be an update on birds. I believe he's going to touch on some of our other concerns in the region as it has entered marine mammals, bears, and in specifically too for foxes in the Bering Strait region. We have the crossover going on. We're not just a transboundary flyway. We're a transboundary, I don't know, swimway as well. So we've got some concerns there. So I thank you again all. Dan, if you could stay on for a second, and Carol, if you're still on, stay on for a sec, and that would be great. The rest of you, thank you so much, and we hope to see you next week. And nice to meet some new friends from all over the Pacific. So well done. Thank you, neighbors. Have a good night, everybody.